Ivy Forrester stood alone in the design room, her hands pulsing against the edge of the sliced table, her reflection gaping back at her from the imaged wall as if demanding answers she had been running from for months, and in that fragile stillness, the weight of everything she had done, every manipulation, every half-verity, every hopeless scheme, came crashing down on her shoulders with a force she could no longer deny, because in the world of the bold and the beautiful, secrets no way stay buried and guilt no way truly fades. It lingers in the corners of every room, in the silence between every discussion, and on this day, Ivy could feel it pressing into her casket so tightly that breathing felt like a battle she was losing, and when she eventually heard the soft click of the office door opening behind her, she didn't turn around right down because she formally knew who it was. She could smell the disappointment before she indeed saw it, could feel the heartache that had followed her like a shadow ever since the verity came out about her rearmost mistake, and when she did turn, sluggishly, her eyes were formally glistering as she faced the family member whose trust she had fractured, whose faith in her had been so steady and undeservedly pious, and the look on their face wasn't one of wrathfulness presently but commodity-worse prostration, the kind that comes from loving someone who keeps making the same destructive choices. Ivy tried to speak at first, tried to gather the countenance she had always reckoned on to talk her way out of trouble, but the words tangled in her throat, and rather what came out was a broken tale that sounded nothing like the confident woman she formerly presented to the world, and that was the moment the gashes eventually revealed over, warm and impregnable, tracing paths down her cheeks as if they had been staying for authorization to fall, and she shook her head as though arguing with herself, as though trying to rewind time to before covetousness and instability had clouded her judgment, before she let fear of losing her place in the family push her into choices that now felt so small and opprobrious. She admitted it also, not with defenses, not with blame shifted onto someone differently, but with raw honesty, that she had been wrong, that she had let covetousness twist her heart into commodity she didn't fate, that she had induced herself she was fighting for love and respect when really she was just fighting her own reflection, and her voice cracked as she confessed that every step she took down that dark path had sounded justified in the moment but unsupportable in hindsight, and she said she was tired of living that way, tired of waking up every day calculating how to stay ahead, tired of feeling like the villain in a story she no way meant to write. The silence that followed her concession stretched long and heavy, broken only by the faint hum of sewing machines in the distance and the distant horse laugh of interns ignorant that a particular reckoning was unfolding just steps down, and Ivy pressed her win against her casket as if she could physically hold her heart together, and through gashes she pledged, truly pledged, that she'd not do anything bad again, that she'd not manipulate or scheme or let despair mandate her conduct, that she'd earn back trust the slow and painful way if that was what it took, and she conceded that remission wasn't commodity she could demand, that it might take weeks or months or longer before anyone believed her words, but she was willing to endure that, willing to sit in the discomfort of her own guilt rather than run from it again. As she spoke, recollections flitted through her mind like scenes from an occasion she wished she could edit, the competitions, the raised voices, the moment someone she loved looked at her with unbelief, rather of admiration, and each memory cut a little deeper, but rather of turning down from the pain. She let it settle because she knew this was the price of growth, and she admitted that she had been hysterical of getting inapplicable, hysterical that her bents and her heart weren't enough in a family filled with larger-than-life personalities, and that fear had driven her to choices that betrayed not only others but herself, and now standing there, stripped of pride and pretense, she realized that the only way forward was through modesty. The family member in front of her eventually stepped closer, not with open arms but not with rejection either, and that small shift in distance felt monumental, and Ivy's gashes came briskly as she repeated that she was sorry, that she understood if trust had to be rebuilt thread by thread like one of her intricate designs, and she promised that from this moment on her conduct would speak louder than any dramatic protestation, that she'd concentrate on her work, on honesty, on being present without ulterior motives, and she indeed admitted that part of her had grown addicted to the chaos because chaos meant attention, and attention meant she wasn't unnoticeable, but she didn't want that kind of attention presently. She wanted peace, wanted to look in the glass without recoiling, wanted to sit at a family regale without wondering who she had hurt that week, and as the discussion strengthened, she heeded, really heeded, to the hurt she had caused, to the frustration and disappointment that had been erecting still for too long, and rather of defending herself, she jounced through gashes, accepting each word as commodity she demanded to hear. And in that acceptance there was a flicker of the woman she used to be before fear reshaped her. The woman who loved fiercely and created beautifully without stepping on anyone differently to get ahead. Outside the office, life at Forrester continued as always, models rehearsing, contrivers sketching, phones ringing, but inside that room time sounded suspended, as if the macrocosm itself was staying to see whether Ivy's oath would be just another dramatic pledge or the morning of a genuine metamorphosis. And when she eventually reached the end of her concession, her voice coarse and her shoulders shaking, she didn't ask to be forgiven right down. She simply said she'd prove it, that she'd show up every day with integrity, that she'd face the consequences of her conduct without resentment, and that she'd choose honesty indeed when it bring her. And there was commodity different in her eyes also. Not the frantic spark of someone conniving their coming move, but a steadier light of someone who has eventually hit the emotional bottom and decided to climb up rather of dig deeper. The response she entered was conservative but not cold, a memorial that redemption in this family had always been possible but no way easy. That words were only the first step, and Ivy jounced as if she had anticipated nothing lower, because deep down she knew that trust, formally cracked, requires tolerance and thickness to mend. And as she wiped her cheeks and took a shaky breath, she felt lighter in a way she hadn't in months, not because everything was fixed but because she had stopped pretending it wasn't broken. And when she eventually walked out of the design room and into the bustling corridor, she didn't carry herself with the same calculated confidence she formerly wore like armor. She walked with quiet resoluteness, apprehensive that people would brute, apprehensive that some would misdoubt her, but also apprehensive that she had made a choice that signified a choice to step down from manipulation and toward responsibility. And in the changeable, emotionally charged world of the bold and the beautiful, where backstabbings and rapprochements shape fates every day, Ivy's gashes marked not just a dramatic moment but a turning point, a sincere and vulnerable pledge that she'd no longer let covetousness or fear mandate her path, that she'd rebuild what she had damaged with tolerance and sincerity, and that this time, when she said she'd not do anything bad again, she meant it with every fragile, hopeful piece of her heart. The days that followed Ivy's tearful concession didn't magically abolish the pressure that had settled over the halls of Forrester Creations, and if anything, the air felt heavier, charged with implied dubieties and conservative ganders that followed her every move, because in the dramatic macrocosm of the bold and the beautiful, redemption is no way granted in a single occasion. It unfolds sluggishly, tested by temptation and shadowed by history. And Ivy understood that now further than ever as she arrived beforehand the coming morning, long before the other contrivers filtered in, determined to begin proving that her oath had substance behind it. She stood at her drafting table with a mug of coffee growing cold beside her, sketching with an immutability that came not from ambition but from intention, pouring her focus into fabric lines and delicate outlines rather of conniving exchanges or calculating influence. And when steps echoed down the corridor and familiar faces appeared in the doorway, she forced herself to meet their eyes without recoiling, offering a quiet greeting that carried no docket, only modesty. Some responded politely, others with reserved nods, and many avoided her aspect entirely, but Ivy accepted each response as part of the consequence she had earned, reminding herself that discomfort wasn't discipline, it was growth, and growth infrequently felt graceful. Latterly that autumn, when a small but significant misreading erupted between two inferior contrivers over credit for a conception sketch, Ivy felt the old instinct rise within her, that sharp, opportunistic voice prompting her to step by, manipulate the narrative, and position herself positively in the fallout. But she broke, physically stepping back rather of forward, and chose commodity radically different translucency, suggesting they sit down together with their administrator to clarify benefactions rather than letting resentment mold. And the surprise on their faces was subtle but unmistakable, as if they had braced for her to exploit the pressure rather than diffuse it. And that moment, small as it sounded, felt like a palm she didn't celebrate audibly but carried still in her casket. Still, redemption wasn't a straight path, and latterly that week when she set up herself alone in the exchange, eavesdropping a discussion that could have given her influence in an ongoing family disagreement, her heart pounded with the familiar exhilaration of knowing she held information that could cock the scales in her favor, and for a split second she imagined how fluently she could use it, how a precisely timed disclosure could shift alliances and restore her influence. But also she flashed back the look of prostration on her loved one's face during her concession. flashed back the way her own voice had broken when she promised not to do anything bad again, and rather of pocketing the secret, she walked down, designedly leaving it untouched, and though no bone witnessed that choice, it signified further than any dramatic protestation ever could. Gradationally, subtle changes began to ripple outward, not in grand gestures but in everyday relations. She heeded further than she spoke during meetings, she credited others openly for their ideas, she abstained from fitting herself into conflicts that didn't bear her involvement, and when someone brazened her directly about one's jest, she didn't redirect or minimize, she conceded it with a quiet, "You're right. I handled that poorly," words that felt foreign on her lingo but honest in their simplicity. Indeed so, not everyone was ready to believe in her metamorphosis, and whispers still circulated that Ivy's guilt might be another advised act, that she was simply regrouping before her coming move, and those rumors soaked further than she anticipated, because this time she truly was trying, and the pain of being misdoubted tested her resoluteness in ways she hadn't anticipated, forcing her to defy an uncomfortable verity. Earning trust needed tolerance without guarantees. One evening, after a long day that left her emotionally drained, she set up herself alone in the office again, gaping at a half-finished design, and for a moment the old fear crept back in, the fear of being overlooked, of fading into the background while others commanded the limelight, and gashes welled in her eyes not from guilt this time but from vulnerability, because choosing integrity didn't automatically quiet instability, it simply removed the lane she formerly reckoned on to silence it, and she rumored to herself that she'd not go back, that indeed if doing the right thing meant slower recognition or smaller dramatic triumphs, it was still worth it. The real turning point came during a family gathering at the Forrester manse, where pressure had historically coddled just beneath the face, and Ivy knew that any wrong word could reignite old resentments. Yet when a heated debate broke out about a recent business decision and someone subtly suggested that Ivy might have outside knowledge that could sway the argument, all eyes turned to her, staying to see if she'd seize the moment, and she felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on her, the implied dare to return to form, but rather she calmly stated that she had nothing to add beyond what had formerly been participated intimately, that she believed translucency was essential moving forward, and the room fell silent not with outrage but with a flicker of respect, and though the shift was slight, it was inarguable. Subsequently, a family member who had formerly been among her harshest critics approached her intimately and admitted that they had noticed the difference, that while they weren't ready to forget the history, they could see she was making in trouble, and those words, conservative yet sincere, meant more to Ivy than any grand reason ever could, because they gestured that her oath was beginning to register beyond her own heart. Still, she didn't allow herself to grow perfunctory, understanding that thickness over time would be the true measure of change, and she committed to small diurnal disciplines, checking her motives before speaking, asking herself whether her conduct aligned with the woman she wanted to come, choosing collaboration over competition indeed when contest tempted her, and sluggishly, nearly gradually, the atmosphere around her softened. Associates began inviting her input without dubitation. Family feasts felt less like battlefields and more like fragile openings for reconnect, and Ivy herself felt commodity strange yet deeply resting peace. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it didn't come with applause or exculpation, but it settled into her like a steady twinkle, cheering her that she no longer demanded chaos to feel significant, and as weeks turned into months, the narrative girding her shifted from reproach to redemption, not because she demanded it but because she embodied it, and in the ever-turbulent geography of the bold and the beautiful, where characters frequently circle back to their worst instincts, Ivy's quiet continuity stood out precisely because it demanded theatrics, because it was embedded in responsibility rather than ambition, and though she knew she'd always carry the memory of her miscalculations, she no longer viewed them as stains she demanded to hide but as assignments that reshaped her precedences, and whenever mistrustfulness hovered to resurface, she returned to that moment in the design room, the gashes, the broken tail, the pledge, and she reaffirmed it quietly to herself she'd not do anything bad again, not out of fear of consequences but out of respect for the person she was eventually getting, a woman who understood that true strength wasn't in overreaching others but in learning her own impulses, and as she looked ahead to whatever new twists and trials awaited in this dramatic world, she faced them not with colluding computation but with steady resoluteness, ready to prove that indeed in a place defined by treason and passion, genuine change was possible. As the season shifted into its coming dramatic chapter, the ripple goods of Ivy's oath continued to shape not only her own trip but the delicate balance within the Forrester family, because in the heightened emotional geography of the bold and the beautiful, metamorphosis is no way insulated. It challenges alliances, unsettles battles, and forces others to reevaluate their hypotheticals. And Ivy began to realize that her commitment to change was still impacting further than just her own heart. It was altering the way people interacted with her, testing whether they were willing to release the interpretation of her they had grown habituated to fighting against. And that process was as complicated as any scheme she had ever orchestrated, because some family members sounded nearly disoriented without the familiar pressure she formally brought into every room, as if her restraint left them doubtful how to respond. And there were moments when she tasted that many indeed preferred the old Ivy, the predictable antagonist whose moves could be combated, over this steadier, introspective woman who refused to engage in power plays. Still, she held establishment, reminding herself that change wasn't about earning applause but about aligning her conduct with the pledge she had made through gashes. And when an unanticipated occasion arose to unite on a high-profile collection that would place her reverse in the limelight, she approached it not as a chance to reclaim dominance but as a chance to demonstrate integrity under pressure, openly inviting input from associates she had formerly viewed as competition and participating credit in interviews rather than subtly situating herself as the architect. And though many journalists tried to bait her with questions about history conflicts, she answered with measured grace, admitting that she had made miscalculations and was concentrated now on growth rather than contest, a response that surprised indeed her, because it felt natural rather than rehearsed. Yet the true test of her metamorphosis came when an old adversary brazened her intimately, criminating her of carrying this redemption as a long-term strategy, averring that no bone changes so snappily without an ulterior motive, and rather of snapping back or defending herself with sharp-edged affront as she formerly would have. Ivy heeded, allowing the blameworthiness to land without retribution, and calmly replied that dubitation was accessible given her history, but that she was prepared to let time be her advocate rather than words, and that quiet confidence disarmed the battle in a way no argument ever could. Latterly that evening, alone in her apartment, she reflected on how different her life felt without the constant hum of manipulation guiding her opinions, how the absence of secret dockets created space for commodity softer, authentic connection, unguarded horse laugh, moments of vulnerability that didn't need to be weaponized. And she realized that for time she had equated power with control, believing that staying three-way ahead assured security, but now she understood that real security came from thickness and tone respect, from knowing that she could walk into any room without rehearsing a narrative or anticipating fallout from retired schemes, and that mindfulness filled her with a quiet pride that felt sturdier than any dramatic palm she had ever finagled. Still, the world around her didn't suddenly come simple.